Hi everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully you've noticed that, believe it or not, both quizzes have been graded. Actually got the second one done early too. I did go ahead and spot you guys 3 extra credit points since I took so long on the second quiz. This way I figure it's fair and that you guys were waiting, so now you know where you stand in the class and so forth. And we are actually ahead of schedule, believe it or not. So for this next week and possibly the week after, we're only going to be having 1 lecture per day. I figure you guys have done incredibly well. I can always add more material, but we're definitely making good progress. And so if we don't cover absolutely everything, we can deal with it a little bit later. All right, so now let's talk about invasion of the land by vertebrates. So that's us, by the way. We as vertebrates came late to the land party, about 370 million years ago. Okay, so the tetrapods, the terrestrial vertebrates, came from the lobe-fin fish, if you guys remember the name. Those are the sarcopterans. The lobe-fin fish have their name because they have fairly fleshy fins with some sturdy bones that are the same as ours. And realize too, there's 2 living survivors these days. Coelacanths, they live in deep salt water near Madagascar, and lungfish. They live in freshwater and they're distributed in Australia, and they actually have lungs, by the way. Now the thing to remember is that neither is believed to be a link to the common tetrapod ancestor directly. As far as who set foot on land, both of them are sort of earlier branches of the lobe-fin lineage. Now, the coelacanths and the lungfish are pictured above in the upper right, and you can see the lobe-fin fish and the early amphibians down at the bottom left. And here we have a nice little timeline where we're going through the late Devonian and looking at all the different other critters that were living at that particular time. You're not responsible to memorize everybody, of course. Just kind of get an idea of what's going on and who's where and when. Now, once critters started actually moving to land, a few things obviously had to change. And so it's kind of interesting because scientists have sort of lumped these changes into different groups as far as how they came about, okay? And so if this doesn't make sense right away, don't panic, because what's going to happen is we're going to go through and talk about an example for each one. But what we're going to do right now is just go over sort of the major themes that are going on, and then when we hit the examples, we'll come back to this again to make sure everything makes sense. So first off, new morphological novelty. Okay, so this is basically a new trait that was sort of built on existing patterns, but really had to have new way of developing, like the hand. Okay, so the hands, they were new, okay, but they definitely, if you consider the lobe-fin fish, the bones were there. All right, so that's one sort of theme that was going on as we were transitioning to land. A second is modification of a pre-adapted trait. Okay, so this trait was kind of ready to go for this. It just needed a few little tweaks. And this is where the lungs came in, which is actually quite interesting. Okay. Third theme is you could have an exaptation of a trait that had some role in the aquatic environment, okay? But then once there was a shift to land, everything had to change a bit. And so that's when it adapted to land specifically. So one example of this is producing urea. So the reason our body produces urea, and did in our lobe-fin ancestors, was because when they were moving to land, they had to get rid of excess nitrogen in a way that wasn't toxic to the body. And we'll come back to that. And then last but not least, modifications that involved invading land that had new selection pressures. For example, breathing air contributed to an altered rib structure. Okay, so whether we realize it or not, it takes a lot of strength in the ribs to be able to breathe in, breathe out. Okay, and so the rib structure and the musculature changed a lot and was basically modified. And therefore, once we moved to land, that modified and then built upon the structure that was already there. So again, I know this is a little hazy and it's always a little wonky, but it's the way scientists actually classify this. And as we go through and talk about each example, I promise this will make more sense. So you might be asking yourself, if the ocean was such a happening place, why in the world did the vertebrates move to land? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. Let's talk about that. So there are a couple different hypotheses that might potentially address this. And I want you to keep in mind that's not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first is the classic hypothesis, and this is based on the living lungfish that still exists today. Certain freshwater fish would live in seasonal pools, meaning they dry up over time. Over generations, they've evolved the ability to drag themselves from one pool to the next as they successively dried out. Okay? The second is the predation hypothesis, where a young lobe-finned fish would spend time in very shallow water to escape the predators. Okay? And then eventually in time, they moved to land because it was even more protected. And then last but not least, the food hypothesis, that there was a growing resource of invertebrate food, and this drew some predators ashore. And so if you happen to be curious, there's some circumstantial evidence for this, and that's the fact that early terrestrial vertebrates were all carnivores, which is actually pretty cool. Okay, so in the water, the Devonian was the time for a great radiation for fish. The placoderms had evolved into many different forms, sharks had diversified, the acanthodians were also present, and then one offshoot of the acanthodians were the sarcopterans. These are the lobe-finned fish, okay? The others that may have been around were the actinoperans, which are the ray-finned fish. Those probably came about in freshwater habitats. But basically, by 370 million years ago, on land in the Devonian, we had full forests. They were spreading inland. There were young coastal wetlands, and that's probably where the lobe-finned fish lived, okay? They weren't shaped for long, deep ocean swims like the sharks and the tuna. They were kind of better suited for sudden bursts through sludgy water. By the way, I am not. I used to work as a waterfowl biologist. I hate sludgy water. Anyway, lobe-finned fish had begun to decline already, believe it or not. However, they would eventually evolve back into larger forms, okay? They would live in the muck. And then they had limb-like structures that let them move along the bottom of lagoons. And this also allowed them to push up on their fins to breathe. Okay, so there's definitely a lot of things that were happening and changing. And basically this lifestyle positioned our ancestors to start taking their first steps on land. Now, what the fossil record tells us is that there were two critters that basically give us our knowledge about the transition to land. The eusthenopterans, which that means true strong observer if you happen to be curious. This was a Devonian lobe-finned fish that had walking abilities, although they were a bit limited, and their skull was a lot like an amphibian. Then we had the ichthyostegas, which means enclosed fish. This was the critters of the early Mississippian. They're an early tetrapod, and they had shoulder girdles, reasonable legs, etc. Once again, they could definitely tell they were starting to make their way onto land. Now, the eusthenopterans are definitely one of the earliest aquatic chapters in our history. First discovered by a farmer in the 1880s, it was basically the first discovery of a tetrapod ancestor. It's interesting because it could basically pass for an ordinary fish like a pike or a muskie, but it had a squat head and stout lobes for fins, okay? It controlled its fins with a small set of bones that were compressed to our own versions of our own arms and legs. They had, by the way, a humerus, an ulna, and radius. And then they also had femur and tibia and fibia. How cool is that? Okay. Additionally, the skull was a series of paired bones. Okay. This was relatively new because ours are like that, by the way. And so these traits indicated that the eusthenopterans were a pretty close origin of tetrapods. All right. Now, they don't reveal the full transformation. However, they definitely could bend up their snout, lower their jaws. They could attack a fish with a bigger bite. The majority of the primitive tetrapods could not do this, okay, because the bones in their brain cases were firmly bonded together. But these guys were pretty unique and had some cool stuff. Now, interestingly, eusthenopteran had evolved an internal air passage called the choana, and this allows air breathing through the nostrils in all the tetrapods that evolved later. They also had lungs, guys. How cool was that? So you might be asking yourself, why did they have the ability to breathe air? And I would say, oh, good question. We're going to come back to that later. Now, a later semi-terrestrial chapter in our story is the ichthyostega. So they had the same bone pattern as the lobe-finned fish. They had a long snout, as well as some other characteristics of the tetrapod. Now, there's no signs of gills in these guys. The spine was sturdy, hips and shoulders are massive, and the skull is rigid. But there was still a suture in the skull, much like other lobe-finned fish. It's interesting, though, because the tail was an intermediate between the tetrapod and the fish. Tetrapods have simple tails, consisting of long series of tapering vertebrae encased in flesh. But the bottom of the ichthyostega's tail had a modified tetrapod form, while the top was very fish-like, so you could see how there was a dual use there. So basically, Ichthyostega had made the transition to be able to live part-time on land, okay? Um, Now, do keep in mind, though, that this is not exactly the prettiest and most graceful critter for our genealogical forebears. So we'd like to think of ourselves as gracefully coming out of the water, you know, graceful and not, tripping and like, looking ever so sweet and kind. But the reality was, is our ancestors were a 3-foot long, sprawling beast, drug its tail on the ground, eyes on the top of its head, and a toilet bowl lid of a jaw that would snap down with piercing fangs on its prey. So, hate to say it, but that was us. Okay, so let's trace the origins of some key traits that would help in the tetrapod transition to land, okay? So we're going to start with what's known as the pre-adapted nature of urea and understand how it became exapted as a way to deal with desiccation on land. We know that all tetrapods basically survive in a desert of air or mostly made up of water, and we desperately try to keep the water inside of us, okay, so entrapped with our skins and scales and so forth. All of this trapping the water runs into a conflict with some of our metabolic reactions. Basically, we eat a lot of food that has too much nitrogen, and so what could happen is that could link with hydrogen and turn into ammonium, which is poisonous. Now, nobody have any bad flashbacks to chemistry, okay? So just realize that ammonium's poisonous, and if our body didn't deal with it, we would be in big trouble. However, ammonium dissolves well in water, and so the reality is we would have to urinate gallons of water to flush it from our systems. So the way our body dealt with this is to join the ammonium in our livers with carbon dioxide to create the safer compound of urea. So tetrapods can let urea build up in the kidneys without getting poisoned and then basically get rid of it in a flow of urine. Some animals living in really dry habitats are even more careful with their water, and they turn it into a powder called uric acid before they even excrete it. Fish, by the way, share up the same metabolism as tetrapods, and they churn up just as much nitrogen, but when you're in a freshwater lake or river, they simply flush it out through their gills. In the ocean, it's not easy to dump ammonium because water is loaded with salts, okay? And the reality is, I don't know if you guys know how our nerves work. They work with sodium channels, and so that's how our nerves fire, and that's how we move and our muscles move and so forth. And so the reality is if our salt balance is off, your body's not going to work properly. So, ray fin fish solve the problem by excreting the salt or excreting the urine through special glands. Okay. Sharks are interesting, though. They turn the ammonia into a urea, and they make their blood salty. Okay, so that's actually quite fascinating. And then it doesn't interfere with the nervous system. But in 1966, scientists took a look at the blood of coelacanths, and they found it was full of urea as well. Therefore, before the invasion of tetrapods to land, it appears that sharks and lobe-finned fish had already invented urea to survive in the salty ocean. So basically, when our lineage, which remember came about later, of the lobe-fins left the saltwater for land, the ammonia buildup was still a problem, but they already were prepared for it by exapting it to urea to deal with nitrogen excretion. Okay, so I know it's a long and complicated story, but that's kind of the way evolution works, and it does give you a more complete picture of what was going on. Okay, so in contrast to urea, as far as the hand goes, this is a morphological novelty. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, well, how did the hand evolve? And I would say, oh, that's an excellent question. So at one point in time, it was thought that the digits were just homologous extensions of bones in the fins, but this is not actually true. Okay. So as the arm develops, the humerus forms first, stretches until the cells thin out, and then clumps and branches into the radius and the ulna. Then what happens is the radius continues to grow into one or more bone, known as the radiale, a knob at the end of the radius. The ulna branches into two rib bones, which branches into more bones. One branch extends across the top of the ring, forms a digit arch with the fingers sprout around it. Okay, therefore, our ancestors' fins were built from an axis that branched along one side. Well, what ended up happening with us is that axis ended up turning the other way, okay, to become what was called the wrist. In order to do that, what would have to happen is that the evolution must have flipped the expression of the Hox genes. You guys remember the Hox genes? Okay, this is what they're doing, guys. So in order for this to happen, the Hox genes had to change how they were expressed, and the genes had to switch. Therefore, it was considered a new innovation. Okay, and again, this is the way scientists classify it. I know there's a lot of detail there. Just realize that evolution is complex. In order to get the Hox genes had to go in there and kind of flip things around. Okay, and so our fingers are basically not homologous with the rays of ray fin fish, but they're new and different, and they arose only in the lobe fin fish. What I'd like you to notice, though, is that there are a lot of trials in the evolution of the hand, as you can see here, in critters that went extinct long before. So it's not as if it was a straight line either. Okay, so there were a lot of critters that had different numbers of digits. Some were successful and some weren't. Okay, so let's talk about how the hyomandibular bone tells an even different story with regards to it was basically recruited as extra parts to a new function, which is hearing. So it's thanks to these bones that we can hear, guys. Okay, so to understand how the ear evolved, basically you have to realize that the stapes in the human ear corresponds to a large bone known as the hyomandibular. And initially, the hyomandibular's purpose was to help support the jaws of fish. Now, the human jaw opens like a door, hinged on both sides of the mouth. Okay? In contrast, when the Devonian lobe-fin fish would open its jaw, it would involve a series of actions that were quite complex. The brain case was made of numerous small bones. The hyomandibular would brace the lower and upper jaws against the back of the brain case all at the same time. It helped to open the gill flap. It was basically really, really complex, okay? This arrangement worked for the lobe-fin fish because the mechanism used for breathing and feeding were coupled together, all right? But once it came to humans, this had to change, okay? And so the bone ended up evolving into our ears, which, you know, or our ear bones, which allow us to hear, and we are actually quite grateful for that. Now, it's not until you pay attention to the Yancanthostaga's head where you see that the hyomandibular was first became obsolete, okay? So their snout grew 5 times longer. This was way too long for the muscles to bend it efficiently. What ended up happening from an evolutionary perspective is the brain case fused shut. The jaw began to make direct contact with the skull. Biting became simpler. They didn't need the hyomandibular for support anymore. So other bones in the skull became stronger. The stapes would loosen and transitions to start transmitting sound to the brain. Okay. So the hyomandibular stopped straddling the head and shoulders of the tetrapods and then started to work and attach themselves to the jaws to open and shut in support, leading to the creation of the tetrapod neck. I know, a lot of complex steps. Basically, just realize it wasn't like flipping a switch. Initially, the bones that help us with hearing used to support the jaw, but they don't anymore, and they would eventually turn into bones that are used for hearing that we are grateful for today. All right, so our final story involves the pre-adaptation of lungs for terrestrial life. Now, the classic story of lungs, and this is what Charles Darwin thought, by the way, was that lungs evolved from the swim bladder of fish. He thought that fish that breathed with gills first evolved a swim bladder to adjust buoyancy, and then later that turned into a gas-filled structure that would become the lungs, okay? And by the way, the swim bladder, for those of you that are not into fish, that's what allows fish to have, to determine where they will be in the water. So if they need to surface or get close to the surface, they'll fill it with gas, and then that makes them float. If they need to go to the bottom of the lake, they will get rid of the gas, and it makes them sink. Okay, and you can see how there's an evolutionary advantage to that, because if you're trying to hide from predators, it's really, really helpful to be able to control where you're at with regards to in the water. But it turns out that that might actually not be the case, and it seems to be that the swim bladder was actually the derived trait, which is actually kind of interesting. So initially, the old swim bladder to lung scenario made sense because they thought that early tetrapods would live in ponds that would no longer become functional. However, it turns out the fish system's actually not that evolutionarily useful. Okay, and so what's interesting about this is that if you make a trout swim too fast for too long, the fish will actually die because the system is not actually designed well. This is really fascinating. Go to the next slide. So let's talk about the circulatory system for fish. So remember, the circulatory system is what will send oxygen-filled blood to the body. And all critters have to have this, okay? All aerobic ones. And so fish, though, are interesting. And so it turns out that if you look at a fish's circulatory system, the blood goes to the lungs. I'm sorry, it goes to the gills. To the lungs, we're not there yet. The blood first goes to the gills. That's where it picks up the oxygen. And then it goes to the rest of the body. Okay? And then the last organ it happens to hit is the heart before it goes back to the gills again. And so basically, the heart does not receive a lot of oxygen. Okay, and this design is actually not very well done. And so fish that actually have true lungs have way more stamina. Okay, so when you have a fish that has this classic design, if you do make them swim too fast for too long, they will die because their heart will not get enough oxygen. However, fish that have lungs, of course, they actually have lungs, and therefore they don't have this issue. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that fish seem to have evolved lungs maybe 60 million years before they invaded land, and so therefore they were pre-adapted to moving ashore. Okay, and so lobe-fin fish, much like the lungfish, they pull in air and they expand their gill arches in their mouth, and then they close their mouth, and then they force the water to go over their gills. Okay, much like other fishes do, but again, that system does not exactly work so well. However, when it came to moving to land, and they already had the lungs, that worked out beautifully. Now, the last part that they needed, by the way, to actually move to land and have everything go smoothly is to have those lungs be able to take in a lot of gas and then release a lot of gas. And that's where the next slide actually comes in. All right, last but not least, one of the most important evolutionary shifts as we started to move to land was having a full rib cage lined with additional muscles that could expand the rib cage and create low pressure, which is what allows the lungs to breathe in. Okay, tetrapods like the Eusthenopteran had ribs that barely poked from the spine, didn't help with breathing. In early tetrapods, the ribs would grow larger, okay, and that would both pull in and exhale air. And so, once this happened, they were much better adapted and better suited for living on land. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, the tetrapod transition to land gives us some general lessons on the evolution of life. Some traits were new, okay? Some were pre-adapted to different conditions and then switched. Some were exaptations, others lost function, okay? All of these modifications, many of the changes meant that the gene regulation patterns, the Hox genes, had to change, all right? And so they would have new rules, kind of like the development of hands, okay? And others were constrained. But the reality is, remember, not everything is perfectly well known because we know what's wrong with the fossil record. But B, that finally, okay, we got to land a bit fashionably late, all right? Now, as I said before, this is going to be your one lecture for Monday. We're running ahead, and if you guys have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and I will chat with you again on Wednesday.